This is Greenwood's Legal's Employment Law Nowcast, Episode 3. Today we're talking about AI in the workplace. Enjoy the podcast. Hello and welcome to Episode 3 of our Employment Law Nowcast. In our last episode, we spoke about AI generally and kind of the rise of AI, some of the many amazing things it can do. We spoke about the UK's first AI employee, Avery Ingram, and the case where the Pakistani judge had used AI to help him make his decision. Today we're going to be focusing a bit more on the use of AI in the workplace. And I'm joined again by John Macaulay and Keith Williams. Thank you both for your time today. So let's launch straight into it then. Why might employers need an AI policy for their employees in the workplace?
So I think there's a whole range of different areas we probably need to be aware of, and the one that I wanted to start off with was looking at accuracy of information. So what I'm thinking about here is we talked last time about the fact that this is a piece of software effectively that learns by the information that is being put into it. So obviously there's a question as to what about the information that's being put into it, but in particular when something comes out from something like ChatGPT, how accurate is it? And there's a term that has been coined, which I'd not heard before, which I think is really interesting, which is artificial hallucination. So that's really where the piece of AI actually produces a very confident response, but it's not actually backed up by the data that has gone into it. So it may come up with, and the example that's been given is, for example, it might come up with a figure for the revenue of a particular company that's not backed up by the data that it has. It might rank that as very accurate, and then it will continue to mention that as an accurate piece of data, and that will then be part of the AI system effectively, so it continually kind of reinforces that original piece of information.
I suppose it's really difficult, isn't it, for the humans using AI, whatever that is. I know we've spoken on the previous episode about ChatGPT, which is kind of the main one at the moment. It's impossible, I think, to know exactly what information ChatGPT is looking at, for example, and you really need to have your wits about you in taking what is produced from ChatGPT or other AI platforms as the truth. And it's my understanding that unless the user then corrects AI or ChatGPT, it, as you say, it will continue to use that information until it is corrected. It can be corrected because it can learn like a human, but it's definitely a huge thing to be aware of.
Yeah, and there's already a number of examples out there of situations where this sort of artificial hallucination has taken place. So, for example, there was a litigant in person who was preparing for a court case, and they produced 4 cases in support of their position. One of those cases had a name that was completely fabricated. The other 3 case names were real case names, but the passages that the litigant in person cited from those cases were all false.
Wow.
And they had all been generated by ChatGPT. So that was a situation where the litigant in person was potentially in trouble in front of the judge because they'd put forward cases that were just not correct. In that case, as I understand it, the judge took a fairly lenient approach in relation to this and recognised that it had been done entirely innocently.
Yeah, it wasn't malicious,
No.
was it? And I think that was a key point. But who knows what may happen in the future?
Yeah.
It's kind of the most human thing about AI, isn't it? That if it doesn't know, it is prepared to make it up.
Yeah.
And then be really confident making it up. You're really replacing the bloke down the pub who a litigant in person might have gone and asked in the past. He doesn't need to do that anymore. He can ask AI, and the AI will give as confident and inaccurate a response as any bloke down the pub might be capable of.
Yeah, and interestingly, a bit like the example you gave last time, Keith, about the judge, there's also an example of a qualified lawyer in the US using AI for a brief to court in relation to a PI case related to an airline, and used AI to generate cases in relation to the brief, and the cases didn't exist. So, this situation where now he's facing potential reprimand from the court, having relied on AI and not checked that was actually correct in terms of what was being put forward. So it's not just the litigant in person, but people who are qualified in whatever it is are using that tool in a way that could potentially be very powerful. But again, coming back to a point we made several times in the last episode, unless there's that human check, there's going to be a difficulty in knowing exactly what's going on and whether the information is correct. So an employer knowing that AI is being used is the first step, and then making sure that there are those appropriate checks. The other example that has come out is the National Eating Disorder Association had a chat bot called Tessa, which was effectively a bit like a sort of chat function that you can have on a website. Now, there were two aspects to this particular one. First of all, it was discovered that it was providing information about eating plans and calorie restriction, which were potentially harmful. So that caused a huge amount of problems for the NEDA. So they had to remove it and obviously then look into how it had gone about issuing that kind of information. And then the other part of that was that there were 4 workers who worked on the chat line who were dismissed, and that's brought into focus the question of, was the chatbot put in place in order to replace people? And the NEDA say no, that absolutely wasn't the case, but there is now a dispute between these 4 employees and the NEDA about the extent to which that might have happened. So that's another area of how AI is being used and the view that employees and others might take of the situation.
I think it's really interesting, definitely, and I think because of the speed at which kind of AI has developed recently and the prevalence of it being used, I absolutely do think a policy is becoming more and more vital to kind of draw boundaries for these kind of things. Like any policy, we've got a holiday policy, for example, even though it's quite clear in a lot of the law exactly how holidays in the UK operate, we've still got a policy. And even especially with something like ChatGPT, it's not clear how it operates yet. So I think that's even more reason to have a policy. I read something about some Samsung employees. I think Samsung are considering banning the use of ChatGPT after a few of their employees, I think, had uploaded some of their kind of confidential code and also some meeting notes to ChatGPT, which obviously Samsung found a bit alarming. So I don't think they have banned it yet, but this was as recently as April this year. So there's definitely lots to consider, and it's throwing up lots of issues.
Yeah, there's all sorts of issues really with the use of AI and potential risks around both personal data relating to individuals, which actually would probably be worth its own edition of the podcast one day, because there's huge amounts there, but also things around commercially sensitive data. Because the sorts of things that people might use Chat GPT for, or other AIs are available, but that seems to still be the classic one that's being used. It's entirely possible that people will inadvertently be releasing confidential or commercially sensitive information into the wider world without it even realizing it. I remember, I'm old enough to remember when things like Facebook became a really big issue initially in the workplace, and it simply didn't occur to people that they would be putting stuff on Facebook and that their manager would be able to see it immediately. And there'd be the number of times I got phone calls from clients saying, we've just seen that so-and-so employees put this stuff on Facebook criticising the company or criticising their manager. And it was simply because people weren't used to this massive technological revolution. They still thought they were talking to their friends at the in the canteen or at the coffee machine or whatever. They didn't realise that they were publishing, and of course there was a massive evolution in IT policies around that time to sort of the do's and don'ts of social media. And this is the same sort of scale, at least I think, the same sort of scale of revolution. So people, say you're doing a presentation at work, and you might be using the Microsoft Copilot for producing a PowerPoint presentation. You might be using ChatGPT to do the same sort of thing, and it'd be really convenient. You put your company's sales figures in there, you put in your key clients, you put in your sales information for those clients, you put in the pricing. All of that stuff is being released into the internet. You're not simply sitting at your own computer doing a PowerPoint presentation. You're actually releasing it straight out there, and it makes it absolutely clear on OpenAI. They're the company that make ChatGPT. It makes it clear on their privacy notice at the start, when you start using the software, that stuff will be collected. That stuff will be collected, and it will sit within their within their servers, and it can be used again and again. So you could potentially have a situation where one individual at a company is inadvertently putting lots of commercially sensitive information into ChatGPT. If you had someone else, a competitor or the client that they're talking about, for example, asking specific questions and asking the right questions, they could be getting fed that information straight back out again. And so I think it is really important that you have clear ground rules within your workplace as to what people should or shouldn't be using AI for, and what they should be putting in and what they shouldn't be putting in.
Yeah, it's certainly a lot to think about. Have we got any other thoughts about what a policy might need to include or absolutely should include?
I mean, I think the starting point, as I said earlier on, is the usage of it, understanding that it is being used. So I think employers need to be aware when it's being used, because that's really the starting point for anything. I think then there probably needs to be some guidance around the kinds of tasks that it's suitable for, and the things that you wouldn't expect it to be used for. I think there also needs to be some information about the checking process, and the fact that simply using AI to generate a result is not the whole task. There's a question of checking it, making sure that we guard against some of the examples that I gave earlier on, and then obviously the information about what you put into Chat GPT or any other form of AI in terms of customer information, company data, all of that kind of stuff, because that is really key as well in terms of what's being disclosed. As Keith said, there is a key point about personal data being put into whatever platform it might be, because all organisations will have some form of privacy notice which indicates how personal data is used, and I would imagine that a lot of them will not have something about it being placed into a platform like ChatGPT and used in certain different ways. So thinking about what personal data is placed in a platform like that, how it might be used, do the data subjects actually know about it? That's a whole sort of topic on its own, and one that, as Keith said, we'll cover in a future podcast. But I think there needs to be not only something about that in a policy, but also some further work on other data privacy documentation in order to deal with it?
I think for me, and quite rightly, companies take real huge steps to guard their own confidential information, the information of their employees, that kind of thing, through policies, through IT systems, and it's extensive. To me, when I used ChatGPT, it did feel a bit different, and it didn't feel as though if I were to put some sensitive information in there that it would go anywhere necessarily. And I wonder whether that will be a trap that a lot of people are falling into, because it feels familiar, because it feels to me quite similar to Google. That feels fairly harmless, and all of a sudden we've got this really powerful platform that's developing and learning all the time. I do think people need to be really mindful that it is very different and could cause some quite serious trouble if that kind of information is being put out there.
Yeah, and I think the thing for me, and perhaps it's not that long ago, perhaps I was of this mindset as well, that that AI is something that as an organisation you can deal with when you decide the time is right to deal with it. But you can't do that. You can't wait until you've decided to engage with it, because employees are engaging with it right now. And I think you gave that statistic last time, Micheala, about the research that said that for something like 46% of people who are using AI in the workplace aren't either informing their manager or getting their consent. So even if you think, and it's really easy to think, this doesn't apply to me yet because we don't use it, that doesn't mean that employees aren't already using it. And you need to, I think it would be ridiculous to suggest that you need to prevent it or stamp it out, because this is coming everywhere, and no one is going to be able to stop the advance of AI. But you do need to be managing it and regulating it, so that you can identify when it's being used, what process it's being used for, and so far as possible, it's being used safely. I think I'm never quite sure what to make of this fact, but the ChatGPT has been banned altogether from 4 countries in the world, and they are China, North Korea, Russia, and Iran. So, all authoritarian regimes, and they are the 4 countries so far that have said we don't want to engage with this on an official level. So they've been blocked from use of ChatGPT. But that feels to me like a short-term solution. You're not going to be able to stop this, but you do need to be regulating within your own workplace how it's being used.
And I think that point comes back to this global summit that Rishi Sunak is putting in place, because I think what is absolutely clear is it's not something that lies within sort of territorial boundaries. You can't say, oh well, as the UK we're going to do this, because the fact is it's a global platform, and therefore unless you have a global approach to realising its potential and developing it safely, it's not really going to work. So I think from what I've seen, the success of these sort of global initiatives is going to be key in order to make sure that it that it actually works in terms of the safe development of AI. Because as Keith said, it will develop, and it can bring incredible benefits, but it's a question of that sort of safety side of it, developing it safely.
Yeah, I agree. The world, in terms of these things, the world is definitely getting smaller, I think, and it is sweeping the world. So as much as possible, I agree, it does need to be a joined up approach. I'll be really interested to see how that pans out. Have we got any more thoughts about what might need to be included in a policy, or have we covered everything?
I mean, I think those are probably the key ones. And I think it's like anything else, as understanding of the way in which employees are actually using AI develops, and as new products become available, policies will need to be adapted. But I think initially it would be good for organisations just to kind of stop and think and say, right, well, whether we know it or not, the likelihood is that AI is being used somewhere. So would it not be better if we at least had some initial safeguards in place, and then develop from there as the information becomes clearer as to how it's being used? I mentioned last time about Microsoft Copilot, and obviously when that comes on board, there may well be other things that need to be included. One of the things that I noticed from Copilot is it's not just about the information that you put in, but the system will almost make its own decisions about what it feels is relevant to the question that you ask. So the example I gave last time of the presenter and the daughter's graduation, they asked it to produce a presentation. So Copilot went off and went through all of the individual's photos in order to upload photos into the presentation. Now, on the instructions that I saw, it didn't specifically ask for it to do that, but it goes away and it does what it feels it needs to do, and it uses the information that is available to it. So even if you haven't specifically said, can you use this information to provide me with X, if you ask a question and it has that information available to it, it will go away and use that information. So all of that means that we just need to be alive to the different ways in which it may be used in the workplace, and just come up with some guidelines which will need to develop over time.
I think it's fascinating, and I think the key takeaway then is getting ahead of the curve, getting a policy in place, and even if it's not perfect at the start, because we're not sure how employees are harnessing it, or how indeed employers want employees to harness it, it's getting something in place and keeping it under review, because this certainly isn't going away and it will continue to change, and it's about keeping up and then getting ahead of the curve, I think. Great. Okay. Shall we leave it there for today? You mentioned a kind of a future podcast covering the personal data kind of aspects linked to ChatGPT. We have lined up our excellent colleague Penny Bygrave. I think she's going to come onto a future podcast to talk a bit about that and kind of all of these topics. So AI use in the workplace linked to personal data. So that's one to watch out for. But until then, thank you for listening.